Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor John Bicofus has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a session on the culture of fear and its globalization under the neoliberal experiment in the last 45 years or so. The culture of fear historically has been associated with dictatorships, far right wing governments. And the ultimate goal of the culture of fear, in other words, manufactured fear, and we'll talk about primal fear versus manufactured fear by institutions, public and private. Um, the fact is that this is something that has a goal, it has a purpose. The purpose is by those who cultivate it is to induce conformity and bring the public into a state of acceptance of the status quo. Now, let me give you one example before I go on. The most infamous, I should say, not famous, but infamous case of someone who promoted the culture of fear was Hermann Goering. During the Third Reich, one of Hitler's top lieutenants, he was very high up in the Nazi hierarchy. He started with Adolf Hitler. He was closely linked to the SA, to the stormtroopers. Uh, Goring was involved in the coup in 1923, that failed. And it meant that Hitler wound up in prison, and that's where he wrote Mein Kampf. Goring was later on. Hitler gave him command of the Luftwaffe, which was the commander for the Air Force division of the armed forces. He was also involved um, in the concentration camps. He had a role in the concentration camps. Goring was a master propagandist. Not that there were not others, but he was one of the master propagandists, along with Joseph Goebbels, by the way. Um, and he was a convicted war criminal. He was caught, and he did face war crime charges at the Nuremberg trials, uh, basically led by the United States. The United States led that effort. Goring believed that the people must be brought to conformity through fear. And specifically, he argued that generally speaking, which shows you that he was not unaware, he was not totally, although he's been totally out of touch with reality, although he's been described by many as a psychopath, and of course, there's no doubt that he was. Obviously, he was involved with the Holocaust. Um, he argued that people, generally speaking, the average person, generally speaking, the population, general population, is peace loving. They don't want war. To give you an example, because of course the Third Reich, the Nazis, were highly militaristic, social Darwinist, and militaristic. He maintained, however, that the people can be brought around. Although they don't war, they can be convinced to support war. And all the state has to do is inculcate fear into their minds. And the way it does that is it convinces them that anyone who is against war, any pacifist, is unpatriotic and a national security threat. In other words, the exact same line of thinking that many non fascist, non Nazi societies, governments use today. Okay? Pluralistic societies use that same line. And anyone who is against war doesn't realize, is naive to recognize that the reason that the state goes to war, the government goes to war, is for the defense of society, because the other side is the enemy. And the reason war is executed is to defend the population and the national interests. So, although this is important because this argument has been used since World War II, and I'll tell you what Goring concluded here. Uh, what you do is, although you're on the offense, like the Nazis, they were the aggressors, you tell the population in the world that we're on the defensive. We're not the aggressors. We're in the defensive, right? So then they get behind you. You mobilize popular support through that kind of propaganda. Now, the Nazis, granted, were master propagandists. Okay? He then concluded that this formula of fear inculcated into the minds of the masses works with all societies. Doesn't matter what they are. Obviously, he was talking about Nazi Germany. He was talking about Germany. He was talking about the Third Reich. But he argued it doesn't. It's not just the Third Reich. It works with all societies. Now, uh, so much for that, because today we have democratic, liberal democracies, pluralistic societies who cultivate the culture of fear, not for foreign policy goals only and to promote militarism, as we know, by the way. And this is not just in the West, it's globally, it's other countries as well, many other countries, non-Western countries. Uh, but there is another element here, and that element that works very well and has worked very well is to promote the neoliberal political economy. Uh, Fear and the culture of fear, which is an integral part here, fear is very effective in everything from selling products to consumers. And the number one product, and we see this by the evidence that bottom line, cash value, the number one product that results from fear on a world scale, and I'm not saying it's not necessary, this product is not necessary, right? This service is not necessary. I'm just saying that the insurance industry on a world scale is well over 7 trillion and 105 trillion dollars GDP, global GDP. Insurance is based on fear. This is not to discount and to dismiss concerns, realistic concerns about accidents and so forth. And I'm not saying that. But there is insurance of just about everything, everything you want to buy. The country leading in insurance purchases is the United States, which is not surprising because it is the cradle of neoliberalism, and from there although it really starts in Europe, and England under Thatcher was the first prime minister to institutionalize it after it was experimented, after the US experimented with neoliberalism in Chile using the IMF as well as private advisors, University of Chicago professors like Friedman and the CIA. Um, Fear is an effective marketing tool. Okay, many scholars since COVID-19, since 2020, have argued that the culture of fear worked miracles for the pharmaceutical industry, especially, obviously. This is not to argue that, and I'm not against vaccines, by the way, at all. I'm not an anti vax person at all. But this is not to argue that vaccinations were not necessary. But however, it is to point out that the added element of fear in popular culture, which starts with a hegemonic culture, the dominant culture, and filters down to subcultures, to the popular sectors, okay, fear has been effective. And the culture of fear has been globalized just like the economy has been globalized, so has the culture of fear. Uh, this is largely because of technology. Let's admit that technology has made this possible. The means of communication, social media, global media, uh, transportation, the fact that people travel around the world much easier. There is a closer touch because of mass communications, as well as the fact that the culture of fear is just another export like cell phones. Um, and it is an important because it's an important catalyst in marketing the neoliberal political economy, which is privatization, deregulation, low taxes on corporations, and class warfare, by the way, anti-union, anti-trade union, anti-labor policies, as well as militarization, especially by NATO. This is not my conclusion. They make no, in the last meeting they had in Washington, D.C., they made no apologies about the fact that they are interested in global expansion. NATO started out in 49 as a European, 48, 49, I guess, as a European based, transatlantic based, because the US was behind it, um, transatlantic based organization to contain the Soviet Union and the embryonic Soviet bloc. Now there are no limits. It's global. It wants to be all over the world. Although there is no Soviet bloc, by the way, although there is no Soviet bloc, right? That threat is over, and there is one world economy. It's the capitalist world economy, and within degrees, almost every country is operating within the neoliberal model within degrees. China less, the US more. Um, the fact is that this organization, inculcating fear into the public, into at least the West and those in non Western countries like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, who embrace the organization, inculcating fear into them. They argue we're a defensive organization. Although, when you look at the empirical evidence, everything from the $1.5 trillion budget collectively that they spend to where they have military bases in 178 countries, to where they are right now having two proxy wars, one in the Middle East and one in Ukraine, proxy wars. They refuse to come to the diplomatic table. Doesn't mean that the other side, by the way, is made up of angels. I don't want to give the wrong impression. It takes two to have a diplomatic solution. However, they hold the cards. They hold most of the cards. And they have made no secret that they prefer military solutions for ever war policies, as the neocons in the United States point out. Now, I want to further expand on the issue of fear and the social contract, the culture of fear and the social contract. The social contract under which most countries operate, almost all of them, is a neoliberal, not all, but most, is the neoliberal contract, which, again, neoliberalism starts in the 70s, expands in the 80s, really takes off in the 90s, and is globalized. This doesn't mean that that capitalism 500 years ago, which starts 500 years ago, transitions from 1450 on to 1650, the embryonic stage of capitalism, the long 16th century, that capitalism was a national, it was always an international based economy. It was never local, never national. Capital has always been international. However, globalization has entailed reduction of tariffs, reduction of corporate taxes, deregulation, movement of capital, repatriation of capital back to the country. You invest in Nigeria, you bring profits back to England, and so forth and so on. So privatization of public state enterprises, you hand them over, literally hand them over, massive corporate subsidies, bank bailouts, insurance bailouts, corporate bailouts, public money transferred, public money transferred from the taxpayer, the general taxpayer, into the coffers of corporations. How is this done? Unless you inculcate fear and you make fear the state and the private sector using the media as well as consultants and pundits and analysts and think tanks using all means available to inculcate fear into the masses, to have them accept the idea that unless they go along with this, it's to the detriment of society, therefore to their own detriment. In other words, it's to their own detriment to have lower living standards, higher inequality, social inequality, and to have massive capital concentration, which has been the result in the last 45 years of the neoliberal political economy. Okay, so the culture of fear is the catalyst. It's the catalyst for the success of the neoliberal experiment. Now, fear, let me uh, deal with a little bit academic aspect of this. Fear is, I mean, the first time I studied fear when I was an undergraduate, it was in a psychology class. It was in an introduction to psychology, and then when I took advanced psychology courses, it was in those classes. So fear is the domain where obviously psychologists, psychiatrists deal with. And phobias, which is a Greek word, phobia means fear, by the way, it's the same thing. Phobia, however, is it's a mental uh, illness. There is a segment of the population, the global population, that has phobias. That now it is fear is universal to human nature. Uh, Human beings are wired, in other words, it's in their DNA, to have fear. It's not exactly an instinct, but it is in their DNA. It's an emotion, and it's a reflex emotion, and it's linked, because it's linked to the instinct for survival. Many people believe it is instinctive. Anyway, the ultimate fear is illness and death, and it's universal. Fear of the unknown in human nature, only natural. People fear earthquakes. People fear floods. They fear natural disasters, and they should, right? And this is why in ancient societies they believed in, they deified, that's what I should have said, they deified and worshiped the forces of nature because they feared the forces of nature, so they worshiped them. You see now the connection between the culture of fear today and how human nature started. In other words, human beings fearing to an extreme degree will become docile and worship. They will conform. Human beings, however, have also been manipulated by the elites historically because the elites know that human beings have fear of the unknown, fear of natural forces. The elites know that human beings are afraid, so they will become submissive because of fear. So they have been manipulated. So there is fear, let's call it primal fear. In other words, what comes naturally to human beings from the time they're little toddlers all the way to old age. And there is that fear, right? Or there's an earthquake, my God, what are we going to do? And then there is manufactured fear, like Hermann Goring of the Third Reich was pointing out. You can make them fear for their lives. Tell them that the enemy out there is going to destroy us, all of us collectively, unless we attack, go to war. There is that kind of fear, manufactured fear, indoctrination of the masses, so that fear is inculcated into them, or there is fear that unless you buy this product or medication, better medication than the one you're taking, or better product than the one you're using, you're inadequate. You're not going to be in good shape. So fear as part of the public sector by the state to have the population, mobilize the population behind state policies, domestic and foreign policies, or fear to have the population support what the Third Reich did, namely war crimes, right? So fear has been a very effective tool. And when it becomes part of the culture, by the way, and we'll get to how fear has increased across the Western world, by the way. This is how effective it has been under the neoliberal model. That according to public opinion polls, the level of fear has actually risen substantially under neoliberalism. This is not by accident. Human beings, since the early dawn of civilization, have, and before that, when they were in the state of nature, when there was no organized society, they were afraid of lions chasing them, they were afraid of lightning, forces of nature. However, today, fear is big business. Fear is a commodity to be exploited. And under neoliberalism, it has been globalized. And that is what I wanted to focus on today. Let me give you a very brief overview. Since those of you who've watched my videos before know I'm a historian and a philosophy major, obviously, in college I was, and then taught history and political economy. Um, from Rome to the present, there has been a historical pattern of fear. The Romans were afraid of, from the Republic all the way to the end of the empire, of outside groups to the degree that they were resolved to conquer them, absorb them, or eliminate them, as they did with Carthage in the Third Punic War. So one of the fears they had, and they inculcated that into the masses, was that. So that fear was part of the Roman culture. The Romans and the Greeks were also afraid of spirits and the underworld. Obviously, both the Greeks and the Romans were pagans. They believed in many deities, and they were afraid of the supernatural forces. But the fear, the tangible fear that the state inculcated into them, was fear of outside enemies, and that held together the Roman society until, of course, they bankrupted them, until the state bankrupted the society, and it declined after the death of Marcus Aurelius in the 190s BC, in 190 BC, and then, of course, you have a slow decline in the third century BC until the fall in the fifth century, the fall of Rome. In the Middle Ages, fear was even more effective than it was under the Greeks and the Romans. The age of faith, the age of religion. The ultimate fear of human beings is eternal damnation, especially when this life is so bad as it was throughout the Middle Ages. At least you got eternity to look forward to if you comply with the rules of the church, which are intertwined with those of the secular elites. Because in the Middle Ages, the fact is the secular nobility, that is the lords who owned the estates, the wealthy of the times, the large landowners, from their ranks came the upper clergy, the bishops, archbishops, cardinals. That's who the upper clergy was. Almost always, not always, but almost always. So, in the age of faith, religion was used as a mechanism to control the public, to keep them docile, and to keep them submissive to the status quo. Don't worry if you're miserable in this life just because you're a serf and you're barely making it, and three of your children out of seven have died because of illnesses and because of malnutrition. God still loves you. You'll go to heaven. So the fact is that religion was a very powerful, remains very powerful tool in inducing submissiveness and conformity. The neoliberals are aware well of this and have adapted the neoliberal model according to religious values and religious globally, depending what the religion is in each country they operate. Whether it's Hinduism, which is in India, by the way, under a neoliberal uh, Narendra Modi, he's a neoliberal individual, he's a neoliberal leader, or whether it is under Trump promoting the evangelicals, okay, or under Giorgia Meloni in Italy promoting Catholicism and religion. She makes no bones about it that she's very much religiously oriented. So neoliberalism and religion actually do go hand in hand, including in Islam. By the way, there have been a number of scholarly articles of how neoliberalism has adapted into Islam to accommodate the faith, and comparisons between ethical liberalism, for what that's worth. Now, the fact is that after the Middle Ages, we have a period in the early modern European history, from the Holy Inquisition. The Holy Inquisition in Europe was a domestic crusade by the Catholic Church in collaboration with the lords and the kings to make sure that they induced conformity through fear. And they did it, by the way, by holding trials. And in those, and depending how those trials wound up, they executed those found guilty. This then in the 16th and 17th century brings us into the age of the witchcraft trials, both in Europe and the United States. They went after, they executed as many as 60,000 people. So we're talking about a mass campaign using the power of faith, the power of God, in the name of God, execute women accused and some men accused of witchcraft. So again, the culture of fear through religion, using religion as a vehicle to inculcate fear. In the 17th, again, during the time of the witch trials, the witchcraft trials, in the 17th, 18th century, fear becomes, assumes a racist undertone because of the European U.S. transatlantic slave trade. American, there was no U.S. before 1776, obviously after the War of Independence. But the fact is that the transatlantic slave trade uh, uh, places a racist um, uh, aspect to fear. Europeans before the transatlantic slave trade, by the way, and we know for sure this is so in the ancient world and even in the Middle Ages, did not have the same attitudes of race. So race as bait for fear mongering, and it becomes part of the culture, by the way, in order to for the Europeans and those in the New World, especially in the American colonies, to subject blacks, Africans into slavery. They had to convince the public that these people are beastly, they're less than human, we have to subjugate them. This too is part of the culture of fear. The culture of racism was part of the culture of fear. Racism, ethnocentrism is used to this day, not obviously, we don't have the kinds of slave conditions of the 18th century, 19th century, but it is used to this day as part of the culture of fear. Fear migrants, fear Muslims, fear women, fear the working class, fear, so that so that the state and the elites, the business elites, have the loyalty of the majority and point to the marginalized population, which is exploited even more than the working class, point to them as the real enemy instead of the elites, which exploit the general population. This is the ultimate absurdity and irony that actually, to this day, especially to this day, with the rise of authoritarianism under populist regimes from India to Hungary to Turkey to the United States, they to Italy, France, and so forth. You have France not as a regime yet. Um, Macron is trying to negotiate with Marine Le Pen. We'll see if Marine Le Pen makes it, but she's a neo-fascist. She's a populist neo-fascist. So you have basically fear as a catalyst in having the working class distract its focus. It's all about distraction. Distract from who the exploiting minority is, which is the capitalist class, on whose behalf the state is carrying out policy, domestic and foreign, against other workers and against minorities, against marginalized groups. We come to the Cold War, by the way, and the Cold War is the ultimate scam of fear. There was a period called the Red Scare, the second Red Scare. The first Red Scare comes with the Bolshevik Revolution of the 1920s and the 1930s. The second Red Scare becomes even more ominous. in Europe and especially in the United States. The Red Scare is associated with the McCarthyist era. Joseph McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin, went after alleged communists. Although the Communist Party was legal, by the way, there was nothing illegal about it. Okay, and although they had committed no crimes, um, and there was nothing in the Constitution, in the U.S. Constitution on the Bill of Rights that says you can't be a communist. They went after them in order, it had nothing to do with communism. It had to do with forcing the population, the entire population, using these people as an example, a pretext to forcing the rest of the population into conformity, inculcating fear. The 1950s, the Red Scare era of the 1950s, when the McCarthy era hearings were held in the Senate, was an era of inducing conformity, having people conform to the status quo, to the business status quo, and to the foreign policy of the Cold War, the East West confrontation, and the nuclear arms race, by the way. Pacifism was an anathema. If you were a pacifist in the 1950s, you were a communist, simply because you were against the nuclear arms race, for example. That's a no-no. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the nuclear bomb in the United States, a brilliant physicist, a scientist, okay, who saw the results of his own creation, the bomb, and realized that this weapon was made to be used against civilians. So the man increasingly turned pacifist. Immediately, the US government demonized him, vilified him, and marginalized him, and brought in Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, a European physicist, to replace uh, Robert Oppenheimer. Robert Oppenheimer is one of the American tragedies, a man who was misguided, to be sure. I don't know what he was thinking that this bomb would be used for, but I guess he felt during the war, the World War II was taking place. He felt, yes, we have to defeat the Nazis, the Axis powers, Japan, Germany, and he was right, and Italy, and it would be for military targets. But the fact is, the nuclear bomb was designed to hit civilian targets. And the only use was Hiroshima and Nagasaki, civilian targets. Okay? So fear, he and the whole Red Scare era, which to me, Robert Oppenheimer symbolizes not just the U.S. government going after Hollywood actors and directors and writers, especially writers, and blacklisting a lot of people, ruining their lives, by the way. But this was part of the culture of fear, the Red Scare era. Then we come to the modern period, the War on Terror, which um, I should tell you that Zbigniew Brzezinski, hardly a pacifist, by the way, came out of Harvard, linked to the Rockefeller family. He was like another Kissinger in that respect. Was a national security advisor to Jimmy Carter, argued that the war on terror was a huge mistake on the part of the United States. That it basically appealed to the fear and the irrational aspects of human beings, of citizens. It would solve absolutely nothing except create more terror, which is exactly what has happened, by the way, and that it was not a constructive route to resolving foreign policy conflicts at the regional level. The so called war on terror was, of course, to replace the Cold War, which had just ended in 1990-91, when Gorbachev finished and Boris Yeltsin took over, and there was no longer a Soviet bloc. There was a Soviet Federation. There was a a Russian Federation, and the former Soviet republics had become independent and integrated totally into the West. And there comes Europe and the United States trying to integrate and get as much market share out of these and expand NATO into them, which is they're still trying to this day. That's what the Ukraine war is about, by the way. To this day, that struggle has not ended. However, the war on terror, which is epitomized by 9/11, the catastrophe, a tragedy in September 2001, when George Bush had just taken over as president, that campaign has a lifespan of about 20 years or so. And then, of course, the US and its junior allies is back to the Cold War. However, the legacy of the war on terror remains Islamophobia throughout the Western world. This irrational fear of Muslims, as though Muslims invaded Europe, the United States, Canada, Japan, Australia. Not the other way around. NATO going into Afghanistan, US and NATO going into Iraq, US and NATO going into the Muslim countries. Throughout the Middle East, they have at least 60 secret bases as well as open bases, public bases, as though the Muslims are the ones who have military bases in Europe and the United States and Canada, as though they are the ones causing wars in Mexico to agitate the United States instead of the US, using Israel to weaken Iran and destabilize the entire region, right? So Islamophobia is the legacy of the war on terror. However, that wasn't enough because it's not selling. Back to the war, the old Cold War. We're back to where we started in with Truman um, in the 1940s. The new Cold War against Russia and China, really the goal is China, to weaken China by starting a new Cold War. Uh, and you can't do that unless you vilify China. Because what did the Chinese do? The Chinese do not have 178 bases all over the world. They have three or four. Um, they don't they spend a tiny fraction of what the U.S. spends on defense, and the China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea combined spend 1/5 of what NATO does. Now, that's one fact. The other fact, they don't have the military presence globally. Another fact is the US, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines are agitating in the South China Sea. They're conducting military exercise. They're agitating in the Taiwan Strait. They're agitating in Taiwan. China is not in the Gulf of Mexico agitating anybody. China's goal is economic global integration. China is not made up of angels. I'm going to make this very clear. There are no angels. However, China's goal is economic hegemony on a world scale. That's where their focus is. It is not using the military as a tool for economic hegemony to secure markets globally and force countries through sanctions, through tariffs, um, uh, prohibiting companies from technology transfer, investment, then prohibiting third parties, third countries from securing contracts with Chinese firms in their country, for example, Holland or Israel. not doing business with China, and so forth. So you have basically economic warfare and a Cold War preparing, arming to the teeth and preparing. And how do you do that unless you have a culture of fear? How do you accomplish that? You have to vilify the Chinese. They're evil. In fact, they have been using the word evil. A lot of times, excess of evil. They include other countries. Like I said, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Not that, again, I want to stress, not that these people, they're human. We're all human. Not that these people have descended from paradise and they have angelic wings. Not at all. It's just that you have to judge every government by its actions, not by rhetoric. Fear and the propaganda of fear globalized because the US and the West want the entire world to vilify China and to isolate China, to contain China, to weaken China. So the US can maintain its hegemony and the West can maintain its hegemony. We have seen so far how well that has gone in the last 10 years. We'll see in the future, but so far, results. Again, now let me, because I see we have a few minutes more, and I want to talk about the ideals that neoliberals create, the ideals, the value system of neoliberalism, and the fear mongering and the culture of fear. At the center, at the core of the neoliberal experiment is the consumer citizen, not the citizen, the consumer citizen. They don't recognize social responsibility and community. They, in fact, even the term society. Many liberals, including neoliberals, sorry, including Margaret Thatcher, abhor those terms. They don't want to use them. They believe in the primacy of the individual, and they believe in the value system of atomism, with an ancient Greek word which means selfishness. In other words, you look after yourself and promote yourself, and through that, society will benefit, will get derivative benefits. Um, it's sort of an extension of the trickle down value system. Trickle down theory was popular back in the 1980s. If the rich have mass accumulation of wealth, then some of it will trickle down. And I remember the great Canadian American economist John Kenneth Galbraith saying that this reminded him of the horse eating out of the trough, and whatever seeds spilled out of its mouth, the sparrows, meaning the working class, the horse representing the wealthy, would pick up the little seeds. John Kenneth Galbraith was a New Deal Democrat. He was associated with the Kennedy administration, and he was very critical of the neoliberal system, and rightly so, because it was a system that remains based on class warfare. And this is the point I want to devote myself to in the last few minutes, and that is the culture of fear is all about making class warfare acceptable, the norm, so that the general population, accepts class warfare as the gap between rich and poor widens. And I should tell you, by the way, that, and I forgot, I should have mentioned this earlier, that according to public opinion polls, I stated at the beginning, and I said I would mention, but according to public opinion polls, this strategy has worked because what we have, according to public opinion polls, is the index fear especially among Americans, but throughout the Western world, actually in Western Europe as well, has risen sharply in the last 25 years. In other words, since the war on terror, the fact is the and also clinical cases, that is, people who really need to see an analyst and take some medication. Um, but the fear index has really risen. There is a large percentage of the population and that is that whose worldview, whose mindset is based on the culture of fear. And you see this when you talk to individuals, when you hear them talk, by the way, from the right. Their focus, and all you have to do is you don't have to, you can just turn in some of the right wing news media outlets, whether it's television, radio, internet, whatever you have, a video. You just listen to them talk, and all they focus on is anything related to fear. They want to inculcate fear into the minds of people so they are accepting of the status quo, which is class warfare. Attack the working class, diminish the role of the working class in society, strengthen capital at the expense of the general population. This is a very important point because this means weakening liberal democracy. And the rise of authoritarianism and militarism in the Western world right now, and it has been evolving since 9/11, the rise of militarism under the neoliberal experiment and authoritarianism under the mask, the very thin veil of democracy, has been made possible because of the culture of fear. The more people are afraid, the more they are willing to accept authoritarianism, exactly as Goring during the Third Reich period that Joseph Goebbels and Adolf Hitler wanted people. They had them where they wanted them. They had them scared. They had them afraid. Nelson Mandela of South Africa, the liberator of brought the transition, the end of apartheid in South Africa, was absolutely right. Fear is the enemy of freedom. Fear is the enemy of freedom. So, what we have is a neoliberal regime promoting authoritarianism and militarism under the guise, under the very thin veil of democracy. And in reality, the so-called democracy, liberal democracy, right, the ideal of the Enlightenment era of the 18th century, has turned into illiberal democracy, a system which, just because a country has elections, it's democratic, although the elected representatives, especially in some countries, okay, let's take the United States, since they're having elections in November. If you look at the campaign contributions, not just of the presidential contenders, but the senators and the congressmen and the governors, elected officials across the board, look who's making the big contributions: the multi-billion and multi-trillion dollar companies, and the multi-billionaires who then decide policy. And they are the promoters of fear, who own the media, which promotes the culture of fear, by the way. And it's not just, by the way, this just occurred to me, it's not just the right wing media. A lot of people think, and I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this earlier. A lot of people think it's just the right wing media. Actually, the liberal media promotes fear just as much. They just point to the right wing. The the fact is that the right wing does not have monopoly on the culture of fear and has not been solely responsible, although they have the bulk of the responsibility for this. Liberal leaders, liberal media, liberal thinkers have gotten us to this point where authoritarianism has slipped under the rug, and it's really the system that has prevailed, because the so-called liberals are neoliberals, and neoliberalism has no room for anything other than capital accumulation, capital concentration, capital accumulation, and support for militarism. And by the way, there is an inexorable link, and I should have mentioned this earlier as well, between militarism and violence in society. And you can see it, by the way, in the United States with gun violence and random violence, right? And police violence, the militarization of the American police force. Fear is inculcated into society, and people are looking over their shoulder and afraid of their neighbor, afraid of everyone. Okay? So, this manufactured fear is in the social contract. This is not natural fear like a human being and a man who is, or a woman who is in their advanced age, looking at the prospect of eternal nothingness, that is death. This is not that kind of fear of, knock on wood, illness or an earthquake, uh, some natural disaster coming, so forth and so on. Not that. This is government and the private sector promoting fear deliberately as part of social engineering. Now, for the conclusion in the last couple of minutes. What constructively can we do about this? When you look at the literature on this issue, whether it's by psychologists, sociologists, and other scholars, historians, political scientists, what you see is there is consensus that education is, and critical thinking, education, and an orientation towards social justice and peace. There is nothing virtuous about war, which means killing other people. Even as Goring pointed out, when you want to convince the public that you need to go to war, although you're the aggressor, you tell them that I'm on the defense and that your life, unless you support me attacking those people, eliminating them to conquer them so we can impose hegemony over them, you're a traitor to society. You're not patriotic. You're a pacifist. You're an obstructionist. You're obstructing national security. There is nothing virtuous about that. That's criminal. Just because it has the legitimacy of the state doesn't make it socially just. And there is nothing socially just about rising inequality and poverty, by the way. Nothing. The United States is a very wealthy country, so is France, Germany, and yet we see rising gap between rich and poor. England, forgot to mention England. Throughout the Western world, what we see is rising gap between rich and poor. It's not closing, it's rising. This is alarming. This is alarming because the fact is um, that it does mean the ideal of a liberal democracy of the 18th century, a more equal and just society, equality for all, not economic, social, political equality, is just an ideal. It's not reality. Reality is the culture of fear. I want to thank you for tuning into this channel. I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel. Asad Alim is the owner of the channel. He's created an English language channel. I want you to subscribe We have many guests. He will have many more guests. And until next time, thank you very much for coming in and listening to this. And I will love to hear from you, your comments, and your views and questions. Thank you.